Some of you may have read about 10 days ago a little article that we did in The Guardian called Don't Squirrel Away Your Talents. And what inspired us to write this, in a way, was a reflection back to the time, some of you may also remember it, when we were children and in church or in school. One of the little parables we would be told would be the parable of the talents. If any of you remember the parable of the talents, could you raise your hands? A lot of you. So you'll know it goes roughly like this. A master has 3 slaves. The master goes away for some time and leaves each of the slaves with some talents, which in those times were understood as pieces of currency. And then when he comes back, he sees what the slaves, each of the slaves, has done with the talents. 2 of the slaves invested their talents. They took a risk, really. They tried to build something else from them. And they were rewarded for their investments, for doing something with their talents, for getting a greater return. And the 3rd slave buried his talents in the ground to keep them safe so nobody would steal them. And he was punished. When we were children, because we've talked about this, we never really understood this parable. Not only did we not understand it, but we disliked it. Because in the families that we came from, in my own mother's family, for example, I just buried my mother yesterday at the age of 93 with a long and full working class life. And when we grew up, we lived in times of scarcity. My eldest brothers grew up in the age of austerity and of rationing. We believed that you didn't buy anything you didn't already have the money for. You might save up for it. You might put layaway for your Christmas presents so you had enough money by the time Christmas came to buy them, but you'd never in a million years think of buying Christmas presents on credit or then on HP, hire purchase, or TIC. Never buy something, you never get something you can't pay for, is what our parents used to say. They didn't invest in the stock market. They didn't take wild risks that put their family in jeopardy. They lived in a time of scarcity, and they were in fear most of the time of the precious little that they might lose. And they did not want to put those they loved in jeopardy by doing reckless things with the money they had. And the parable of the talents at the time seemed a profound insult to people like us and our families. Does this make sense so far? Only later have we come to understand, to look at this a different way. Not just because we're older or more comfortable or because we've gone through some kind of spiritual or capitalistic conversion. But we see it in a different way, because what the parable of the talents is saying is, if you're not in a time of scarcity, but if you have more confidence, if you have more support, if you feel more optimistic, you are more ready to take your talents, which are not just a piece of currency, but your talents are your abilities, your capacities, your gifts, the contributions that you can make to others. And if you are in a more secure environment, you're more likely to invest those so that you can share them with others, build them and grow them over time. Are you following this so far? Think about talents now not as currency, but think of talents as human psychological qualities. Our talents, our gifts, our capabilities. What should we do when we invest these talents? Well, if we live in times of scarcity, if we are placed in times of fear, if we are told that only the young matter and the older had better watch their backs, if we are assessed continuously, if we should fear of getting ill or sick or less productive and watch our numbers go down one year or another, if Ofsted perseverates on our failures and does not celebrate and notify everybody with the newspapers when we are on one of the list of the 100 most improved schools in the country. And I was talking to a head yesterday in Lancashire, who is one of the 2 most improved schools in Lancashire, and hardly anybody told them that they were one of the 2 most improved schools. And she said, you can bet your life that if we were one of the 2 least improved schools, they'd be all over it, in the papers and everywhere else, letting us know. If you live in fear of what you will lose, you will not share your talents. You will not spread them around. You will hide them. You will squirrel them away, like a squirrel waiting for the winter to come. You will keep them to yourselves. And this is what an environment of fear, of appraisal, of rating and ranking, of numbers and external judgments, of excessive accountability, of rankings, of league tables, that all these things, of any excuse whatsoever to convert a school into a free school or an academy. Not there's anything wrong with academies, but there is with a whole movement to create pretexts for free schools or academies. If we live in this environment of fear, people will hide their talents. They will not spread them around. We will fail to build professional capital, and the quality of teaching and the status of the teaching profession will go into decline. But if we build an environment which is confident about teachers, which supports our teachers, which builds the quality of all teachers, which sees teaching as something which for most people in education is a lifelong commitment over many years, not something you do for 2 or 3 years before you go on to something else, which values teachers' judgment as well as the data. Judgment as well as data, not instead, judgment as well as data. I spent a month dealing with life and death decisions every day with my mother, who had many things going on with her. And what did most of the doctors say most of the time? There isn't a book on this. You want to know how long she'll last? There isn't a book on this. You want to know whether she'll get better or she'll not? There isn't a book on this. There are questions like, this is what doctors have to do. There's a crucial drug my mother needed that could make a difference. It's not available intravenously. The judgment is you can also insert it as a suppository. But older people with dementia interpret that often as abuse. Do you insert a drug as a suppository that could save her life or maybe interpreted as abuse? There isn't a book on that. And this is the essence of doctors' judgments. And it's the essence of teachers' judgments as professionals, with the data, but not exclusively confined to it, also linked to the people, the character, the community, the values, the ethics, the relationships, the experience that you've built up. Create a secure environment that pushes but supports expects a lot, but wants to move all the profession along, not just a few at the top, and remove the wastrels at the bottom. Then you create a place where people invest their talents, circulate their talents, share their talents, and give their talents for the benefit of all around them. And this is what we mean by professional capital. Professional capital has three sub-components. We'll go through them quickly now. Michael will expand on them as he takes us into the strategic middle part. The first is human capital. Human capital, or human talent, is what are your gifts, your qualities, your qualifications, the level of degree that you have, whether in all the worldwide panic there is now about maths achievement, we have enough teachers with mathematics backgrounds in primary schools as well as in secondary schools, like Finland has, like Singapore has, for example. So it's about qualifications, competencies, capabilities, emotional intelligence, ability to empathize with students, selection procedures that enable you to screen for that and to test for that. This is human capital. The second is social capital. Michael will talk more about this in a few minutes. Social capital is not only how good are we individually, but how good are we together. A common statement now, Michael will return to it, which is wrong, is that a system cannot exceed the capacity and the quality of its teachers. It's utterly false, is this? Of course it can. By how you get the teachers to work together and work with other people. Collectively, you have more than the additive sum of the quality of the teachers. Are you with me? It's the social capital of how you get people to work together, to bring together their talents, to circulate them, to move them around, to share them with each other and with other adults and also the students within the community. And we know from key work done in New York City by Carrie Liana, this is crucial, that social capital will raise human capital. In other words, whatever level your teachers are at, whatever level they start with, if you can get them to work effectively together, they will perform better than when they started as individuals. Poor teachers will become good teachers. Good teachers will become outstanding teachers. Weak social capital will do the opposite. Some of you know, you moved from a great school where you had terrific colleagues, and then you moved to another school where everybody was on their own or always backbiting, or there wasn't even a common staff room, and there are schools like this, so the teachers can't interact with each other, and the little chain can have all its fancy dingy-dangy way with all its teachers as divided individuals, and those schools exist. You will lower the quality of teaching because the social capital is going down. Social capital raises human capital, but human capital, better individuals, greater stars, does not raise social capital. Thinking the answer is a great head of maths, or a wonderful deputy head, or 2 new young teachers and everything will transform, you'll be disappointed if you do not also pay attention to the whole community. This is social capital, and it's great for you if you're any kind of leader, because it's the thing you have the most control over in your working life. Is what, not how can you get the people you want, but what do you do with the people you've got? That is the true test of leadership, and it's one that the public sector has hands down over the private sector, that often has more control over picking the people it wants. And the last is decisional capital, and that's what happens to all this over time. What happens to all this over time? This capacity, when people say, there isn't a book on this, but from my judgment, what I can tell you is. And when they say that to you, the next thing you want to ask the doctor or the teacher or whoever is, in fact, if a doctor's about to do an operation on you, the best question you can ask is, how often have you done this? How often have you done this? And if they say 3 times, they're probably a young doctor who practices on poor people at the weekends. So when they've built up their experience, they can practice on rich people. So one of the first questions always to ask if you've got an operation coming up is, how often have you done this? Because the more often you've done this, the better you're likely to be at it, and the more complications you will have seen. This is Malcolm Gladwell's 10,000 hours. And 10,000 hours in teaching is about 8 years to become kind of master class, or master chef, or master carpenter, to be at the top of your game. To be able truly to say, there isn't a book on this, but in my judgment. And to say it with authority, this is what I think. Related to the evidence, but also the experience, what we should do. If you have a policy of running your school on teachers who come in and are cheap over 2 or 3 years, and enthusiastic, and don't complain, and don't get sick, and don't have sleep, and don't have dependence, and don't usually even have sex except once a month because they're just thinking about teaching all the time. If this is your teacher hiring strategy, you know, and you'll run them like crazy for 2 or 3 years, then they move on. Think of all the capital you're wasting in them as you're just building it up. Think of all the capital you're wasting from your mentors and your coaches who put all their time into them and then they leave. Think of all that wasted investment. But if you stick with a lot of your teachers through 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 years, you develop the decisional capital, the experience, the repetition, the challenge, the stretching, the trying new things, new positions, that give somebody the authority to say, there isn't a book on this, but in my judgment. Or with their colleagues to say, there isn't a book on this, but in our judgment, this is what we would do. These are the essential parts of professional capital that create a secure environment and a supportive but a challenging environment where people will invest in their talents and others to get greater returns. Make teaching a profession only for the young. Evaluate competitively. Keep people moving on. Degrade its university status. Have master's degrees as only Mickey Mouse part-time qualifications done when you finish the rest of teaching, rather than full-time qualifications as they are in Finland. And you will degrade the quality of teaching. You'll create an insecure environment, and people will squirrel away their talents and not share them with anybody else.